Many of you are likely aware that recently the series director for Devil May Cry, Hideaki Itsuno, has announced that he will be leaving Capcom, and I'm sure many of you are wondering what is going to happen with Devil May Cry moving forward. Unfortunately, a lot of what I've seen is just people jumping to conclusions that the series is done for without Itsuno at the helm, or that Capcom will probably start looking to go the remake route with an all-new development team to figure out how to basically make Devil May Cry 6 with development knowledge, assuming that they've never worked on a Devil May Cry game or something similar to it. And while to a degree those are somewhat valid concerns, I'd like to just take a moment to talk about what I think will happen with this franchise and if Itsuno leaving is really a bad thing for the series. I hope I can give a differing perspective that I don't think many people are taking into consideration. So without any further delays, let's get right into it. So do I think Capcom is done with Devil May Cry, and is this franchise just dead without Itsuno? Well, not really. To elaborate, I don't think Capcom is done with this franchise for a couple of reasons. The first being is that with DMC Devil May Cry 5, along with Devil May Cry Peak of Combat, these games have brought in new fans and interest to the series. This is especially true in the case of 5, as it's the highest selling game in the franchise to date and is one of Capcom's top 10 best-selling games as of me making this video. So by sheer popularity alone, I don't think Capcom is going to leave this series to die. With popularity in mind too, the fan surveys that Capcom had on their Capcom Town website, Devil May Cry and Dante are just considered to be widely popular amongst fans. I'll touch on that a little later. However, the second reason I think Capcom themselves aren't done with this franchise is that we have things like Peak of Combat along with the upcoming Netflix anime series. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense when it seems like Capcom is at least open to doing various collaborative projects, or at the very least open to allowing other companies to do new things for this franchise. The final reason, which I think is very important too, is that Itsuno is not the first developer to have worked on the franchise to have left Capcom. I feel as though people are just overlooking the fact that this was bound to happen at one point or another for various reasons. Now, the reality of it is that he's just moved on to new opportunities, and the most anyone can do really about it is just look forward to whatever comes next from that. However, even if that were the case, is that really a bad thing? Look, I love the series a lot, and I'd be happy with us seeing more in the future, but at the same time, I don't think I'd be entirely upset if Capcom decided not to do anything with it moving forward. And that's mainly because I already got the game that I wanted from them to begin with, Devil May Cry 5. And while I have my criticisms regarding that game, I'm just happy that I got to live long enough to see the game that I've always wanted to be made. That being said, I think we'll likely see something out of Devil May Cry in the future, but it's just a matter of having to wait and see. I know there's speculation going around that Capcom may consider remaking some Devil May Cry games, and just to play around with the thought of that potentially being true, I'd be open to seeing some Devil May Cry remakes, but I think it highly depends on how those are handled. Those of you that have been watching me for a while now know that I'm pretty much open to the idea of them remaking the first 3 games in the series. That hasn't changed at all. I just think that if Capcom does go that route, they need to do so in numerical order rather than chronological order, not only because of the gameplay, but also because of the lore that was established with 5. To be fair, I think it's extremely likely that if they were to remake the games, they would probably do so based on numerical order rather than chronological order, if the Resident Evil series is anything to go by. Now, what I do think is interesting is that people are also assuming that a whole new team would work on potential remakes for the series. I understand the logic behind it, but I don't think that would be the case, at least not entirely. I have no doubt that new developers would be a part of the development process for either a potential Devil May Cry remake, reboot, or 6. However, I don't believe that Capcom would just leave that process to an entirely new team that's never worked on a Devil May Cry game before, or an action-adventure hack-and-slash style of game similar to Devil May Cry. If anything, I'd be more inclined to believe that they'd be open with collaborating, if not outsourcing development entirely to a studio outside of Japan. I also think that a series like Devil May Cry, and especially for a remake, new game, or potential reboot, that's likely going to be handled in-house. Hypothetically speaking, if they did have a whole new team, who's to say that the development process wouldn't involve someone like Koji Oda from Capcom, someone who literally made the dev team play through every Mega Man game, list a bunch of things that the team liked and disliked about those games, on top of getting fan feedback through surveys and forum posts thrown into the mix when working on Mega Man 11. I think that would be the best case scenario in this kind of situation, to be totally honest. At least it's better than having another reboot where a new game is made purely out of spite to alienate longtime fans. That aside, I did want to focus on whether or not Itsuno leaving is really a bad thing, and truth be told, I think this might actually be a good thing for Devil May Cry in the long run. While Itsuno did a lot of good things for the franchise, overall, I do think that a fresh perspective would ultimately bring in the much needed changes that unfortunately Itsuno wasn't going to give us in the long run, in my opinion. My biggest gripe with how Itsuno handled this franchise is with him essentially inserting his own OC, Nero, which essentially sidelined Dante for 4 and 5. It's technically true for all of the characters, but having that happen specifically with Dante is an issue because he is the main character of this franchise. The way that I look at it is, imagine if another franchise with a popular reoccurring character did the same thing. All of a sudden you have to follow a new character who doesn't have the same appeal as the original character. Picture franchises like Tomb Raider or Hitman, for example, where in this example suddenly Lara Croft or Agent 47 are replaced by Laura's Butler or Agent 7 instead. It's not to say that these characters can't be well written or they wouldn't be interesting in their own right. It's more so the fact that unless if there's a spin-off or there's a dedicated side story in the main game, or the original character was just written off in a justifiable way, you'd want to see the main character keep coming back until then. That's essentially what I feel in regards to Nero. I don't hate the character per se, just more so that I'm not the biggest fan of how, at least in 5, they just leave it to Nero to take care of things moving forward, even though he's pretty much gotten stronger primarily out of convenience to the story and not through trials and tribulations like Dante in 3, for example. And not to turn this into a DMC5 critique, but his literal motivation throughout the story was being mad about Dante calling him dead weight. It sucks because I think Nero has so much potential as an original character made by Itsuno to stand apart from Dante and Virgil, provided the writing for the character is done better, in my opinion. So with Itsuno gone, I would argue that moving forward, rather than the games primarily focusing on Nero, they could split the focus between him, Dante, and potentially Virgil, or even any other character for that matter. At worst, we'll see certain characters get slightly more or less playtime, but hopefully not to the extent that it has been in both DMC's 4 and 5. Now, one other thing regarding this subject that I'd like to bring up is that Dante is still the most popular character in the franchise. Not only that, but he was voted by the fans as the most popular Capcom character. And while the ending of 5 implies that at least for a small time Nero is going to be doing things on his own moving forward, and if Itsuno were to keep working on Devil May Cry, I'd be pretty concerned that he'd now be force-feeding everyone Nero because that's the way things ended off in 5, unless of course someone higher up at Capcom intervened and said otherwise. Whereas now with him leaving, it leaves the door open for several different possibilities. A new series director could potentially be less biased towards an individual character, which is ultimately what I'd like to see moving forward. However, there's also the possibility that there could be some bias still towards Nero, if not another character. Or worst case scenario, we have another director that decides to make another new OC and has writing in the story that favors them despite what fans think. Aside from that, another thing that I think could easily be changed is actually making new improvements to both Nero and Virgil from a gameplay standpoint. By that I mean finally changing their arsenal. With Itsuno at the helm, Nero's just stuck with Red Queen and Blue Rose. The only improvement to be made with him was the additional moves and Devil Breaker mechanic, which those new features in on themselves aren't bad additions, but why continue to limit him to only one Devil Arm and one Firearm? Especially if he's meant to replace Dante and Virgil, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I would argue it's even worse in Virgil's case to a degree, since he's been using the same setup since Devil May Cry 3 Special Edition, albeit with some more refined mechanics that were taken from DMC Devil May Cry, which is a little odd when you think about how only Virgil gets mechanics taken from that game. Because despite Nero being a very unorthodox character to play as, if they want to include new weapons for him while still keeping his rev mechanic intact, then it would make sense to take the control scheme from DMC Devil May Cry strictly for switching weapons using specific directions on the D-pad. With Itsuno gone, we could finally see some really interesting ideas for both of these characters, which we've already somewhat seen with the game Devil May Cry Peak of Combat as an example. In Peak of Combat, they're actually giving Virgil a different weapon to use outside of what he's used for almost 20 years now. feel really old just saying that. But I think you all get the point that I'm getting at here, is that with a fresh perspective, we can see some really good changes to the series that in my opinion are really needed. With Itsuno at the helm, we would keep getting his vision of what Devil May Cry as a series should be. That's not to discredit all of the good things that he's done for the franchise, but I think it is time for someone else with a new vision that's ultimately going to keep making the fans happy take the lead. One last thing that I'd like to bring up is that Itsuno himself isn't retiring from making games. So we'll get to see in the future where he'll go and what kind of games he'll bring, whether that's a new fighting game, new hack and slash, RPG, or something entirely new. And I think that's going to be really interesting to see how his games are going to evolve somewhere else. Now that said, I know some people are very much wondering where he's going to go, and there's a lot of speculation that he may follow Ryosuke Yoshida, the combat director of Devil May Cry 5, and work at Square Enix, which I think would be really cool if that turned out to be true, especially if that could lead into some kind of collaborative effort. And what I mean by that is something more on the lines of something like Devil May Cry 3, where the Devil Trigger designs were done by Atlas artist Kazuma Kaneko. I think that's a cool thing to imagine, say if an artist from Square Enix were to work on something from Capcom, and especially for Devil May Cry regarding like character designs, costumes, maybe even just Devil Trigger forms similar to Devil May Cry 3, and vice versa. Maybe we'll see something in a Square Enix game that is very much tied to Devil May Cry, and I think it's just really cool to think about. But that is completely hypothetical, so with that in mind, I think the most we can do for now is just wish Itsuno the best of luck in his new development endeavors. One last thing that I'd like to say before wrapping today's video up is that regardless of what happens, I think as fans of the series, we shouldn't be worrying about what is going to happen to the series at the very moment, since there really isn't anything to worry about to begin with. That said, I'd like to know what you all think down in the comments below. If you liked today's video, feel free to give it a like, share it, maybe even consider subscribing, and also, you're in luck if you're actually itching for some more Devil May Cry content, because I just uploaded a new video on the Devil May Cry Netflix anime. So head over to that video if you're interested in more Devil May Cry content. Otherwise, I'll see you all in the next one. Matane.